Right now, you are likely staring into the dark with a stinging, restless heat humming inside your chest, the particular ache of feeling cast out, left behind, or quietly erased by a circle of people you trusted. It is the exhaustion of social exclusion, the humiliation of realizing that whispers have been traveling through a group text or a corporate hallway without you, leaving you stranded on the outside of a perimeter you spent months trying to enter. You lie awake, aggressively dissecting your past words, replaying a specific dinner conversation or a brief meeting, searching your memory for the exact mistake you must have made to deserve this sudden, cold distance. Your mind spins with a sharp, anxious urgency, attempting to solve the mystery of your own rejection, wondering if there is an inherent defect in your personality that makes you fundamentally unlovable to the pack. Let the night space around you breathe exactly as it is, without your needing to curate its texture. The air drifting across the bed carries a crisp, hollow scent, the dry, papery smell of aging wood panels, and the slightly metallic tang of a cooling room. After a long summer day, there is a faint, rhythmic clicking from a blind tapping against the pane. In the midnight breeze, a steady, unhurried percussion that has nothing to do with human opinions or social hierarchies. The shadows in the corners of your room are deep and unmoving, a thick slate that absorbs the lingering friction of your hypervigilant thoughts. You can feel the precise points where the mattress receives the heavy line of your spine, the backs of your hands, and the base of your skull. There is no need to smooth out your clothing or perfect your posture. The darkness holds you without requesting an entry fee. Right now, dear friend, you are safe enough to soften. What you are experiencing in this heavy hour is not failure, and it is certainly not proof that you are broken or fundamentally unsuited for belonging. It is the natural, intelligent pain of a social creature whose evolutionary protective instincts have been triggered by the threat of exile. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, nor will we aggressively demand that you forgive those who locked you out. We are simply going to allow the tight contraction around your chest to rest without judgment. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to figure out how to climb back into their favor before the morning arrives. The mind does not heal the trauma of rejection by begging for a key to a locked room. It finds liberation through a surprising Buddhist paradox. The very moment you are cast out of a narrow human circle is the exact moment your life is being violently liberated from a cage. The suffering you feel is not the loss of real love. It is the shattering of an illusion that your survival depends on the approval of a tiny, conditional boundary. Beneath the burning anxiety of your isolation lies a radical truth. You cannot be truly exiled from the living world, the tight circle that excluded you is just a fragile fence built of human insecurity, while the ground beneath your bed belongs to an infinite, non-judgmental fabric that holds your presence without conditions or prerequisites. Maybe you have felt this too, the secret panic that if you stop checking your phone, if you stop replaying their slides, or if you accept that you are no longer invited, you will simply dissolve into a lonely, permanent nothingness. We carry this frantic desire to belong directly into our tendons, clamping the throat tight, pulling the shoulders up toward the ears, and holding the stomach rigid, as if we are still standing at the door, waiting to see if they will look up when we enter. If it feels right, take a slow breath and simply notice the scratchy, dry quality of that defensive tension right now. You do not need to force anything to relax. Just observe how hard your body has been working to find a way back inside a circle that was always too small for you. Nothing is required of you now. The heavy social armor you wore today, the forced compliance, the careful phrasing, the anxious scanning of eyes for validation can be dropped like a bundle of dry straw onto the floor. Think of a single, oil-rich seed that has been shaken loose from a flat tray by a careless, sudden gust of wind. The seed does not spend its night weeping in the dirt, wondering how it failed to please the wood of the tray. It does not look back at the other seeds with a sense of shame. It simply sinks into the deep, dark furrow where it has landed, allowing the moisture of the earth to wrap around its husk, entirely safe in its new, unmapped solitude. The wind did not destroy its potential. It merely introduced it to a wider, wilder soil where no human fence can track its roots. We spend years treating our exclusion as a personal exile, believing that because a specific group found us dispensable, we are cast out from the universe itself. We try to scrub the humiliation away with self-scrutiny, analyzing our flaws to fix ourselves for the next circle, which only keeps our awareness trapped in the shallow, competitive lowlands of human judgment. What if the rejection you are mourning is actually a form of fierce spiritual protection? What if your life has grown too vast, too honest, or too deep to be held by the fragile borders of that clique any longer? In a moment, our awareness will travel toward a low, ceilinged seed granary behind a remote mountain hall, where an old, deaf gardener spends his days cleaning chaff from green hemp seeds on a braided straw tray. This story will show us a path that does not require you to force your way into any human alliance to be complete. But before we go there, let your weight drop into the wide, unmeasured earth tonight. Feel the cool night air settle into the open spaces of your chest and realize that you are already woven into the same fabric that carries the forest, completely safe, completely seen, and finally allowed to rest in the dark. Behind the grand, lacquered pillar halls of the great mountain monastery, down a path choked with wild nettles and sharp gravel, stood a low-ceilinged seed granary with a packed earth floor. The small building was entirely bypassed by the wealthy patrons and the high monastics who marched in procession to the sound of bronze gongs. Inside, the air was dense and cool, smelling heavily of dry straw, wild field grass, and the rich, oily scent of pressed green hemp seeds. This forgotten corner was the domain of Elder Joanne, an ancient monastic who had grown almost completely deaf over his decades of service. His fingers were thick and deeply creased from a lifetime of handling rough fibers, and he spent his solitary days sitting on a low stump, cleaning chaff from raw seed hulls to prepare the temple gardens for the next season. To this quiet, dusty outpost came a young monastic named Tessan. Tessan had spent the last 2 winters working in the main temple kitchen crew, a highly coveted position dominated by an elite circle of quick-witted novices from noble families. Tessan had desperately wanted to belong to their group, adopting their sharp ways of speaking, laughing at their subtle inside jokes, and constantly adjusting his behavior to fit their narrow definitions of worth. But on the eve of the great summer festival, a quiet whisper campaign had turned against him. Tessan walked into the kitchen, only to find the others suddenly falling silent, exchanging cold, knowing glances. Without a word of formal explanation, his name was struck from the kitchen ledger. and he was reassigned to the lonely seed granary. Cast out from the group he had sacrificed his authenticity to please, Tesson entered the granary with a burning, restless humiliation throbbing behind his eyes. His mind was in chaotic loop of self-scrutiny, replaying every comment he had made during the previous week, agonizing over what precise flaw had triggered his banishment. He sat down opposite Elder Joan, his knees trembling with anger and grief. The old man did not offer words of sympathy, nor did he acknowledge the tense, heavy atmosphere that Tesson brought into the room. He merely reached down and lifted a wide, flat-braided straw tray that rested across his lap. The tray was broad and slightly frayed at the hemp border, its center deeply darkened and stained with the green oil of 1,000 previous harvests. It was piled high with thousands of small, smooth, oval-shaped hemp seeds sitting in a neat, contained mound within the woven boundary of the straw rim. Elder Joan began to rock the wide tray with a rhythmic side-to-side motion. The seeds made a dry, papery rattle as they slid across the braided straw, a soft, hypnotic, scratching sound that filled the dark room, like the sound of summer rain on dry leaves. He was separating the viable seeds from the empty, weightless husks that the wind had left behind. Tesson watched the movement, but his chest remained tight with the memory of the kitchen monastics laughing together without him. Unable to contain his agitation, Tesson reached out to take a handful of the seeds to help, but his hand was clumsy with anxiety. His sleeve caught the frayed, hemp edge of the broad vessel. With a sharp jerk, the braided straw tray tilted. In an instant, hundreds of the smooth green seeds cascaded over the woven rim, spilling down through the air and scattering across the dark, uneven packed earth floor of the granary. They bounced off stones, rolled into the cracks of the mud, and lost themselves in the loose dust of the entryway. Tesson dropped to his knees in a panic, his fingers clawing at the dirt as he tried to gather the scattered pieces back together. He felt a wave of intense shame, believing that even here, in the place of his punishment, he was proving himself to be fundamentally defective. He expected Elder Joan to scold him, to grow angry at the loss of the precious seed. He desperately tried to force the scattered seeds back into the clean boundary of the tray. But the old gardener did not move from his stump. He did not look at the dirt, nor did he drop to his knees to pursue the stray grains. Instead, he reached out with his rough, oil-stained palm and gently tapped the wooden rim of the tilted braided straw tray that still held the remainder of the harvest. Elder Joan looked down at the dark earth where the seeds had fallen, and then he looked into Tesson's frantic, tear-stained face. He pointed a thick finger at the floor, and in a slow, gravelly voice that rarely spoke, he remarked that the seed does not need to return to the tray to be safe. He stated that the tray was never the source of the seed's life. It was merely a temporary box built by human hands to hold what was meant to be free. He asked the young man why he was weeping over what had simply found its way into the wider soil. Tesson stopped his frantic scratching in the dirt, his fingers freezing over a small cluster of green hemp seeds that lay nested in a dark furrow of the earth floor. He looked up at the broad, empty space where the tray had been, and then down at the seeds scattered far beyond the woven hemp border. A sudden, quiet shock of recognition rippled through his chest. He realized that the seeds on the floor were not broken. They had not lost their oil, their density, or their potential to grow. They were simply no longer contained by the narrow, rigid rim of the straw vessel. The tray had kept them clean and organized for the kitchen crew's use, but it had also kept them entirely separate from the deep, moist earth that was their natural inheritance. The wind and his own clumsy accident had not destroyed the harvest. They had simply bypassed the artificial boundary of the house. For the first time since his exile from the kitchen, the hot, constricting coil around Tessan's throat began to loosen. He looked at his dirt-stained fingers, then at the vast, unmapped floor of the granary that opened out toward the wild mountain slopes outside the door. The necessity to scramble backward, to fix his reputation, or to force his way back into that tight circle of novices, dissolved like mist over a summer pond. The silence of the granary became a protective, wide sanctuary around him, and as he let the handful of gathered grains slip gently from his palm back into the open dust, he felt the heavy burden of trying to fit into a small space drop away into the silent ground. This shifting of perspectives in the seed house is not a command to blunt your sensitivity, nor does it ask you to grow an icy, indifferent skin that refuses to care about human connection. It is not an invitation to live in a state of cold numbness, pretending that the sting of being pushed aside by your peers does not matter. Instead, it illuminates something far subtler and quieter about the nature of our social wounds. The heavy, aching grief you carry tonight does not mean your life has lost its direction or its sweetness. The real suffering was not only in what happened when they closed their circle against you, but in the specific way your mind desperately held onto the boundary of that circle long after you were cast out. Deep Buddhist wisdom reveals that our greatest pain emerges from a secondary injury we continuously inflict upon ourselves in the dark. The first wound is the simple, painful reality of human rejection, the cold shoulder, the unreturned invitation, the quiet whisper that leaves us standing alone outside the door. This first wound is a sharp, sudden blow, but it is limited in its reach. The second wound is the one we create when we pick up that flat, woven tray of social approval and turn it into the ultimate judge of our worth. We tell ourselves that because a handful of people could not appreciate our texture, we have been cast out into a barren, useless wasteland where nothing good can ever take root again. We mistake the tiny, fragile rim of their acceptance for the border of the entire living world. When we experience this kind of isolation, our modern emotional habit is to crawl back to the edge of that fence, begging for reassurance, or to stay awake for hours, dissecting our personalities to find the flaw that caused our exile. We believe that if we can just fix our behavior, if we can just become shiny and uniform enough to please the pack, we will be allowed back onto the braided tray where it is clean and safe. But this frantic craving for approval is a profound misunderstanding of your own true nature. A seed does not belong to the basket that carries it to the market. It belongs to the great, deep earth that gives it life. The long effort to fit into their narrow spaces can be abandoned now, not because you have given up on life, but because you have finally realized that you are too vast to be contained by their small measurements. True mindfulness, when stripped of academic language, is simply the quiet capacity to notice how tightly your mind has been gripping the edge of that old, frayed rim. It is the gentle awareness that watches your social anxiety rise, without instantly obeying its commands. When the memory of their exclusion causes your chest to tighten, Modern awareness allows you to look at that contraction and say, this is just the old fear of the wild field. This is just my mind trying to crawl back into a box that no longer fits me. By simply naming the pattern without judging yourself for feeling small, you stop adding a second wound to the first. You allow the humiliation to lose its sharp, cutting edge, turning it into a soft, passing mist that simply drifts over the landscape of your evening. Consider how much of your precious energy is spent trying to protect an artificial image of who you think you need to be included. It is like spending your whole life clinging to the wicker border of a basket, terrified that if you let go for a single night, you will fall into a dark, bottomless abyss. But the insight of the Buddha offers a magnificent, liberating truth. There is no abyss beneath you. There is only the wide, non-judgmental fabric of an interconnected universe that has been carrying your weight since the moment you were born. The people who excluded you are not the masters of your belonging. They are just other fragile, anxious creatures trying to keep themselves from falling off their own tiny trays. This understanding is the true essence of emotional letting go. It is not a harsh, aggressive act of slamming doors or forcing yourself to hate those who hurt you. It is a soft, graceful surrender to the reality of change. Impermanence means that the social groups that seemed so solid, so elite, and so permanent today are actually shifting, unstable structures that will eventually crumble back into the dust of their own insecurity. Their opinions of you are not permanent monuments. They are just light, empty husks carried away by the autumn breeze. When you allow yourself to fall off the tray, you are not losing your footing. You are simply returning to the dark, moist ground that knows exactly how to cradle your presence without demanding that you alter your shape. Compassion begins the moment you look at your own loneliness and stop treating it as a moral failure. It is the strength to meet your overthinking mind with a soft, non-judgmental embrace, recognizing that your desire to be included was just a natural, human search for warmth. You do not need to punish yourself for wanting to belong to their circle, nor do you need to force your heart to heal before the morning arrives. You only need to let the heavy, exhausted narrative of your rejection drop into the open space of this room. The wild field has no doors to lock you out, and for tonight, you can simply rest as a single, unadorned soul held by the same ground that carries the forest, completely safe in the wide, welcoming dark. If it feels right, let your attention slide away from the path of active thinking and drop directly into the immediate, physical experience of your breathing. Perhaps you can observe the quiet, dry sensation of the air passing over your lip as it enters, and the slow, rhythmic hollow that opens up inside your stomach as you let the breath slip back out into the room. There is absolutely no need to force a deeper cycle or to alter the natural timing of your ribs. You are not trying to reach a state of perfect, unmoving stillness, nor are you being measured on how well you can quiet the echo of their voices tonight. Even noticing that your chest feels a bit tight, or that your throat carries a dry, defensive knot is entirely enough. Let each breath arrive on its own unhurried timeline, like the soft scratching of grass against a wooden door in the midnight breeze. As you remain there, you might choose to invite the long, overworked muscle groups of your body to let go of the day's posture. Perhaps you can allow your collarbones to widen and fall, slightly back, softening the hidden hinge where your neck meets the heavy baseline of your shoulders. Notice the tiny, intricate fibers around your mouth and jaw, the ones that spent hours holding up a careful, compliant expression, attempting to look as though you were perfectly unbothered by their distance. Let those tissues go entirely loose, as if a cool, damp mist from a wild mountain valley is passing gently over your cheeks. If you find a stubborn pocket of rigidity in your lower back or behind your knees, see if you can allow those points to sink a fraction of an inch deeper into the flat support beneath you. You are giving your skeletal frame permission to slip out of its social harness, recognizing that in this dark room, there is no longer any boundary you need to defend. Now, see if you can isolate one specific thought or memory from your recent past that has been making you feel particularly isolated or left out. It might be the image of a group meeting where your idea was passed over in silence, the wording of a message that made it clear you were no longer included, or simply the heavy, flat exhaustion of feeling like a permanent alien among your peers. Do not try to push this memory out of your mind or replace it with an artificial visualization of light. Instead, give the emotional pattern a quiet, honest name within your own awareness. You might say to yourself, "This is the old panic of the stray seed," or "This is my mind trying to climb back onto the tray." By simply observing the pattern without any self-judgment, you are stepping out of the role of the humiliated outsider and becoming the quiet gardener who watches the seeds fall into the dust. In your mind's eye, if it feels comfortable, imagine that this precise worry, this burning desire for their approval, is a small, green hemp seed resting on the surface of a wide, flat-braided straw tray. The vessel is large, its edges slightly frayed at the hemp border, and it represents the entire history of the social circles you have tried so hard to please. You do not need to struggle to lift this tray, and you do not need to scold yourself for how long you have been sitting within its narrow, woven boundary. Instead, picture yourself simply resting your palms against the rough, oil-stained straw of its rim, allowing its structure to be exactly as it is, without trying to alter its shape or mend its fraying edges. Perhaps, as you watch that single seed, you can imagine a gentle, unhurried shift in the orientation of the scene. Picture the wide straw tray slowly tilting in the darkness, losing its flat rigidity. Watch as the small green seed loses its balance, slipping over the woven hemp rim and cascading down through the open air. Notice how it does not fall into a painful, jagged abyss. It simply lands softly in a deep, moist furrow of dark, rich earth far below the granary floor. As it touches the soil, the image of the rigid straw tray begins to grow distant, dissolving into the background until the wicker border vanishes entirely. The seed is no longer contained, but it is beautifully nested, wrapped in a thick, cool layer of earth that demands nothing from its texture. You can allow this visualization to slowly fade now, returning your awareness completely to the heavy sensation of your limbs pressing against the bed. There is no requirement for you to feel entirely healed or perfectly confident in this moment. Transforming a long-held habit of social hypervigilance does not occur through a sudden, dramatic breakthrough. It happens through these tiny, quiet moments of allowing the mind to fall off the tray. You can return to this soft, inner practice whenever you are ready, but for tonight, your exploration is complete. Let the air continue to pass through your chest like a cool wind over a wide, unmapped field. You are no longer required to squeeze yourself into their small spaces to be worthy of your place on this earth. For the remaining hours of this evening, you can simply rest as the seed itself, nestled safely within the dark furrows of the night, completely whole, completely hidden, and allowed to sleep. When the high heat of midsummer settled over the mountain, turning the unmapped terraces behind the granary into dusty, dry ridges, Tessin discovered that his deep-seated wound had not healed into perfect tranquility. The sting of exile possesses a persistent echo and a lifetime of looking for safety inside a human group does not dissolve after one afternoon on the granary floor. A travelling group of lamachants arrived at the monastery, carrying fine silks for the high monastics. While sitting near the outer gate, Tessin overheard two of the noble novices from the kitchen crew talking to the merchants. They were laughing loudly, recounting a story from the great summer festival, and then, with casual cruelty, one of them mentioned Tessin's name, calling him an awkward, unwanted creature who didn't know his place and was better suited to rot among the dirt and seed holes. The words struck Tessin like a physical blow, sending a wave of hot, suffocating humiliation straight up to his throat. His ears rang with a sharp, anxious frequency, and the old, frantic voice inside his mind began to scream with absolute, venomous certainty. It whispered that his exclusion was a permanent stain, that he was an absolute fool for trying to find peace in the dirt, and that he needed to march directly into the kitchen, confront them, and force them to see his intelligence. He felt a desperate urge to defend his shattered pride, to argue, or to pack his robes and flee the mountain entirely rather than exist as the butt of their jokes. The quiet spaciousness he had cultivated with Elder Joan felt completely crushed by the reality of their ongoing mockery. Instead of running to the kitchen, his feet carried him blindly up toward the highest wild terrace where the ancient stone monastery wall had collapsed into a chaotic mound of earth and wild vines. In this overgrown, forgotten hollow lived an elderly laywoman named Mother Chio, who spent her days mending coarse hemp grain sacks with thick, split willow vines. When Tessin stumbled into the terrace, his breath was short and ragged, his eyes fixed on the ground in a furious stupor. He found Mother Chio sitting on a flat rock beside a massive, unlined stone cistern that had been sunk into the limestone earth centuries ago to collect the mountain's dark rainwater. Wild mountain sparrows and heavy field crows were landing constantly on the rough, mossy rim of the cistern, dipping their beaks into the dark water to drink before flying back into the wild bamboo forest. Tessin, wanting to escape the burning friction in his head, grabbed a heavy, wooden stirring paddle that lay nearby and began to violently agitate the surface of the rainwater inside the cistern. He wanted to drown out the sound of his own thoughts churning the water until it splashed over the sides, trying to destroy the smooth, perfect reflection of the sky that mocked his internal chaos. He felt a fierce resentment toward the water's stillness, a righteous anger at how unbothered the birds and the mountain were by the injustice he had just suffered down at the gate. He grew breathless, his arms aching from the resistance of the deep liquid, his mind replaying the novice's laughter in an endless, agonizing loop. Mother Chio did not scold him, nor did she reach out to pull the heavy wooden stirring paddle from his hands. She simply stopped her needle, rested her palms against the coarse fiber of the hemp sack on her lap, and watched his frantic movements with an immense, cool patience. When Tessin finally slumped against the stone rim, his chest heaving, his eyes wet with the frustration of his own anger, she pointed a wrinkled finger toward a small leak at the base of the cistern, where a cluster of wild hemp stalks had managed to push through a crack in the ancient mortar. She looked at his rigid jaw and remarked softly that the water inside the stone does not become holy because it is kept inside the temple, and it does not become worthless when it spills into the wild marsh mud outside the wall. She explained that the cistern does not choose which birds are allowed to touch its surface, and it does not spend its nights wondering if the monastics in the main hall approve of its shape. She asked him why he was trying so hard to keep his life locked inside a vessel that had already cracked. She reached out and placed a single, empty hemp seed onto the broad, wet surface of the wooden stirring paddle that Tessin was still gripping. Instead of telling him to clean the cistern or to return to his duties, she asked him to simply watch that single seed sit on the wet wood while the water he had churned slowly came to a halt. Tessin knelt in the dry dust, his knuckles white around the handle, his mind still spinning with defensive arguments. He forced himself to hold the paddle perfectly still, focusing his vision on the tiny, oval grain. And as he held his posture, stopping his frantic desire to strike the water or change his circumstances, a strange, quiet discipline settled into his chest. He took a long, slow breath of the dry midsummer air, and for the first time, he did not try to push the memory of the novice's laughter out of his head. He simply sat with the burning sensation of the humiliation, allowing it to exist without immediately turning it into a command to fight or flee. He watched the wild birds land on the cistern rim just inches from his hand, entirely indifferent to his personal drama, seeking only the pure moisture that held no human name. Under the steady, non-judgmental gaze of the old woman and the quiet return of the water's surface, the frantic loop in Tessin's mind did not magically disappear, but it lost its absolute power over his body. He noticed the angry, cynical thoughts still floating through his awareness, but he stopped treating them as absolute truths. He realized that the novice's mockery was just another light, empty husk blowing across the stone terrace, a passing noise that had no power to alter the green oil. Inside his own core, he had been treating their approval as the only cistern that could hold his value, when the wide mountain itself was already offering him an infinite, unlined basin of belonging. Tessin gently laid the wooden stirring paddle down on the mossy stone, leaving the empty seed exactly where it had fallen. He did not go down to confront the novices, nor did he pretend that their words had not cut into his skin. But as he stood up and brushed the dry terrace dust from his wool robe, the suffocating necessity to fix his image or to force his way back into their circle simply evaporated into the bamboo forest. He chose to sit with the uncertainty of his solitary path, taking one slow, disciplined breath before he turned to help Mother Chio lift her heavy sack of grain, his heart no longer fighting the exile, but finally choosing to remain wide. When we look at the young monastic sitting quietly by the old limestone basin, choosing to lay down his heavy wooden paddle rather than continuing to whip the rainwater into a frenzy, we are witnessing the precise collapse of an ancient emotional prison. The human mind possesses a deeply grooved habit of believing that if it can only replay an insult often enough or analyze its own social flaws, with enough microscopic cruelty, it can somehow build an armor that will prevent future abandonment. We use our anxiety as a clumsy tool of control, convinced that if we never let our guard down, and if we relentlessly rehearse every conversation before we speak, we can force the human circles around us to grant us a permanent place on their flat trays. We spend our midnight hours turning our social injuries into an entire identity, building a thick wall of self-judgment around our chest until we become incapable of feeling the vast belonging that has always cradled our existence. The profound insight of the Buddha cuts directly through this exhausting loop by separating our experiences into two very different layers of discomfort. The first pain is the raw, unpolished reality that life inevitably drops onto our path, the sudden coldness of a long-term partner, the casual mockery of a colleague, the sting of being left out of an important gathering, or the simple fact that some people will look directly into your face and choose not to see your value. This first layer is like the rough wind that shakes the braided straw tray on a dry midsummer afternoon. It is abrupt, it is painful, and it operates completely outside of your control. You cannot command the small cliques of the world to broaden their perspectives, and you cannot force an insecure group to stop protecting its fragile borders by casting you into exile. But the real suffering, the heavy, suffocating heat that keeps you awake while the rest of your house is sleeping, is the second pain. The second pain is entirely what your own mind manufactures out of its desperate resistance to reality. It is the elaborate, toxic courtroom drama you construct around the event. When someone leaves you out, the first pain is a passing flash of disappointment. The second pain is your own awareness rising up to claim that you are fundamentally unlovable, that you must use shame to fix personality before tomorrow morning, and that you must never trust a human being again. We take a single stray seed that has fallen into the dust, and we turn it into a lifelong verdict of worthlessness, completely forgetting that the seed is perfectly whole, dense with oil, and fully capable of growing wherever it lands. We frequently try to cure our isolation by turning our pain into a permanent shield, believing that if we remain bitter, we can never be surprised by rejection again. But trying to heal the wound of exclusion through self-blame is like churning a dark cistern with a wooden paddle, expecting the liquid to turn into a clean, unmoving mirror. The harder you work the handle, the more you splash the mud at your own feet, leaving your awareness more fractured, more anxious, and more deeply estranged from your own natural dignity. True peace does not require you to live in a world where everyone treats you with immaculate kindness, nor does it mean your mind will instantly stop producing fearful thoughts when you are criticized. Peace is simply a completely different relationship with that stray seed. Consider how the old laywoman did not spend her afternoon trying to rebuild the collapsed monastery wall to keep the wild birds out of her terrace. She simply sat on the stone, mending what was right in front of her, allowing the cistern to hold the rainwater, without asking if the high monastics approved of its location. When you practice this form of radical internal honesty within your own evening, you stop treating every defensive thought as an absolute truth that you must obey or defend. You notice the old fear of exile rising up to clamp your throat, and instead of helping your mind pile up new regrets, you look at that anxiety with a wide, spacious attention. You recognize that the burning sensation in your chest is not a sign that you are defective. It is just a sign that you were pushed aside and that your body has been working very hard to find its way back home. This simple shift entirely changes the architecture of your night. When you stop feeding the second pain with your attention, the memory of their rejection begins to lose its suffocating density. An unreturned message or a cold glance becomes just a passing rustle of dry grass against the outer fence, not an absolute proof of your isolation. The uncertainty of your social future ceases to be a monster waiting to erase you. Becomes like the wide, unmapped floor of the seed house, a space where you can rest without needing to secure an invitation. Before dawn, you no longer need to squeeze your soul into their narrow boxes to survive. By allowing your wobbly, irregular history to sit in the presence of your own non-judgmental awareness, you discover an unshakable internal alignment that does not depend on the opinions of the kitchen crew. You realize that you can let the tray tilt, you can let the seeds scatter, and you can still let your own deep life find its roots. Now let this quiet mountain loosening travel across the distance of years and find you right where you are in the small, unrecorded corners of your contemporary daily life. This medicine is not meant to be left on the high ridges or inside the dark seed granaries of memory. It is designed specifically for the moments you spend lying awake in a quiet bedroom, watching the digital clock roll forward while your mind frantically replays a perceived social blunder or an unfinished argument from 3 years ago. It is for those draining afternoons at work when you catch yourself repeatedly checking your screen for a specific notification or message, desperately seeking a brief drop of external reassurance to melt the heavy, cold silt that has settled behind your ribs. We practice this spaciousness whenever we find ourselves offering a hollow, mechanical smile to a colleague while feeling completely detached and heavy inside, wondering if everyone else has received some secret map to fulfillment that we somehow missed. Think of how much internal labor you expend trying to control the shifting currents of your closest relationships, constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal, or silently comparing your own jagged, uncurved progress to the beautifully curated, seamless timelines of strangers online. A sharp glaze of inadequacy settles over your thoughts, whispering that you are fundamentally not enough, that you have fallen permanently behind, and that your only salvation is to work harder. Harden your gaze and never let anyone see how tired you truly are. But a single, unhurried breath, taken tomorrow morning before you unlock your phone, is a magnificent act of spiritual discipline. It is a moment of choosing the subterranean spring over the surface brine. When that familiar, frantic impulse floods your chest, the urge to explain away a mistake, to force an indifferent person, to validate your heart, or to feel deep guilt for wanting to rest, you can simply pause. You can remind yourself that not every cynical thought deserves your obedience, and not every fearful feeling is an absolute command to fortify the gates. You are entirely capable of caring for your life and the people in it, without gripping their responses so tightly that your spirit begins to freeze. True emotional density allows you to leave a difficult conversation or an unresolved text message exactly as it is, without needing to immediately shape it into a monument of personal failure. You can let the cold weather of another person's mood pass completely through the courtyard of your mind, while your own roots remain nestled deep within the warm, silent currents of your own sovereign being. Tomorrow, when the habit of cynical armor tempts you to withdraw or to offer a sharp, sarcastic defense. See if you can let your voice remain soft and plain. Let the genuine texture of your vulnerability show, just like the dark, wet bark of the plum tree when the mineral crust begins to weep. The resilience of your days does not come from pretending to be a flawless block of ice. It comes from allowing your soft water to find its own natural path through the rock. We have been taught by an aggressive, restless culture that we must earn our right to be still, that peace is a luxury reserved only for those who have chiseled away every human flaw and completed every task on an infinite horizon. But this is the ultimate illusion of the frozen mind. You are allowed to rest without earning it. The deep mountain springs do not apologize for flowing through the dark channels, and the winter blossoms do not ask permission from the frost before they push through the limestone fissures. When you lay down your head tonight, let the heavy, critical scripts of your performance drop into the dark mud like discarded iron spades. You do not have to settle the balance of your career or repair every fracture in your history before you are permitted to let your chest untighten. Tomorrow will inevitably present its own cold winds, its own calculating interactions, and its own hard minerals. But you will encounter those moments with a very different kind of internal gravity. You will understand that the warmth you were so desperately seeking from the external world was never waiting for you in the praise of a supervisor or the fickle attention of a companion. It has been running perfectly fluid within the deepest chambers of your own life, all along, cool, sweet, and completely protected by the massive density of your own existence. You can step off the tread of constant self-protection. You can allow yourself to be clumsy, to be uncertain, and to be beautifully unpolished, knowing that your true nature was established long before the lowlands ever tried to weigh your worth. Let the modern hurry dissolve into the crisp night air of this room as we prepare to let the final lines of the story melt into the deepest pools of restorative sleep. The ancient limestone terrace is falling into total stillness now, and the warm midsummer wind has finally ceased its scratching against the collapsed mortar of the northern wall. The wild bamboo forest has dropped to a low, distant whisper, its hollow green stalks resting in the midnight air without shaking loose a single dry leaf. Down below, the dark seed granary sleeps under a thick mantle of shadow, its packed earth floor holding nothing but the deep, quiet velvet of an unclouded night. All the sharp friction of the kitchen crews, laughter, the heavy scrape of wooden stirring paddles, and the frantic, dry rattling of the braided straw tray have been completely absorbed by the immense, non-judgmental earth. The flat wicker vessel has been set aside in the dark granary corner, its frayed hemp border and oil-stained center completely cooling, entirely forgotten by the fingers that clung to it so tightly during the day. Let your own internal pacing slow down to match the massive, unhurried density of the mountain slopes. With each quiet breath that enters your body, you are sinking deeper into the soft security of your own bed, allowing your limbs to become as heavy and as motionless as ancient roots nested far below the reach of human voices. There is no longer an audience watching for your reaction in the dark corners of this room. The shadows have completely swallowed your social history, your obligations, your anxiety, and the exhausting necessity to maintain a flawless performance, to stay inside a circle. You do not have to solve a single interaction tonight, nor do you need to arrange your memories into an immaculate pattern. that proves you were worthy of their invitation. Your physical frame is becoming immensely heavy. Your breathing is becoming beautifully quiet, arriving and leaving, like the soft, warm vapor of rainwater rising from the deep limestone cistern after the sun has set. Let the skin around your temples relax completely, letting go of the vigilant, scanning gaze that spent the day looking for signs of withdrawal or judgment in the eyes of others. Let the weight of your skull press deeply into the supportive surface beneath you, recognizing that the earth requires no credentials before it accepts your shape. You are returning to the vast, unlined fabric of belonging that belonged to you before you ever learned to fear the wild field outside the fence. The rich, green potential running through your deepest self requires no validation from their narrow ledgers to be pure, and it requires no permission from a clique to keep its inherent density. It simply rests in the dark, sovereign, genuine, and immeasurably secure, protected by the massive depth of the living world that knows nothing of human exclusion. You have full permission to stop managing your reputation for the remaining hours of this night. You have permission to be clumsy, to be isolated, and to let your long-held social fear drop back into the loose dust without a single trace of guilt. The group can keep its small tray, and the perimeter can stay closed without ever touching the core of your existence. Slide down completely into the dark furrows of the evening, where the loose soil wraps around your worries, and the current of your breathing becomes perfectly clear, deep, and still. You are safe enough to drop the heavy paddle. You are dense enough to let the open earth do its work. Let the dark night hold your entire weight without an explanation as you drift far away from the narrow rim of their acceptance and dissolve into the infinite wild sanctuary of the forest floor. And as the last trace of tension vanishes into the shadows, what if the exile you feared was actually the universe pulling you out of the basket so that your roots could finally touch the unconditional depth of the whole world? Let your awareness expand gently into the vast, dark emptiness, trailing after that question, allowing the words to settle like heavy grains of sand sinking through the cool, silent depths of an unlined stone cistern. The restless, analytical mind may still try to wander back to the edge of the old granary path, checking if the kitchen ledger has been corrected, or if your name will be whispered again when the morning sun strikes the valley. But each defensive thought is now nothing more than a pale, distant leaf drifting across the surface of the midnight reservoir. You do not need to reach out and stop the leaf from moving. You do not need to measure its weight or determine if its shape matches the standards of the monastery halls. In the profound quiet of this wilderness, the seed does not ask the basket for a certificate of worth. It simply drops its shell into the black mud, completely content to let the world above maintain its borders. Listen closely to the massive, comforting stillness that enters your room when you finally stop demanding that a human clique grant you permission to exist. It is a dense, velvety quiet, the kind that fills a mountain valley after the summer storms have passed over the ridges and the wild bamboo forest stands perfectly motionless under the constellations. For so many years, you have treated your own sensitive spirit like an uninvited guest that had to be continuously polished, rephrased, and pruned just to be tolerated by a tight circle of observers. You believed that if you permitted a single rough, unaligned edge to show, the pack would find your vulnerability and cast you out into a cold, bottomless abyss. But the old laywoman sitting by the stone mortar did not look for sacks that had never been torn. She looked for the open, empty space that was ready to receive the raw harvest, without any pretense. Your long-held social anxiety is not a permanent defect that you must violently eradicate through a cycle of forced smiles and self-reproach. It is simply the residual tightness left behind by an intelligent organism that has spent too many seasons trying to survive inside a basket that was always too narrow for its wings. It is an evolutionary echo that is completely soluble the moment you stop treating the tray as the boundary of your universe. When you stop trying to force your history into a perfectly smooth, acceptable narrative for the people who failed to hold you, you give your body permission to inhabit the full, heavy gravity of its own bones. You allow your breathing to drop down from the tight, scanning chambers of the throat and settle into the quiet floor of the belly, where the natural current moves undisturbed by the rumors of the marketplace. There is no one left to impress in this dark room, no one to defend yourself against, and no nobler, more compliant shape for you to achieve before you are permitted to let go. Let the entire image of their exclusive circle and its cold, knowing glances fade from your vision like a tiny patch of dry straw carried off by a midnight river. The unreturned messages, the forgotten invitations, the sudden silences, and the constant pressure to pretend you are perfectly fine are all just light chaff floating on the surface of a deep, unyielding mountain lake. They drift with the passing wind, they dissolve against the stones, and they possess absolutely no authority to reach down into the cool, dark bed where your true substance resides. You can allow the surface of your life to be troubled by the human weather. You can let the outer rim of your world ripple and tilt if it must. But down here, in the quiet sanctuary of your own being, nothing is moving. You are anchored by the simple, undeniable reality of your own existence, fluid, nameless, and perfectly secure. Perhaps you can feel a subtle, spreading coolness beginning to occupy the center of your chest, a quiet reassurance that emerges only when the exhausted sentinel finally steps down from the perimeter fence and sits by the dark rainwater in the hollow. The gates are shut. The social harness can be unbuckled, and the rigid, pleasant mask can be laid aside on the grass. You do not have to be the hyper-vigilant protector who anticipates every incoming rejection tonight. You can let the heavy timber of your defenses rest against the earth, trusting that the universe is fully capable of holding your presence without your assistance. You can rest without a strategy, without a modern defense, and without a single plan for how you will face their perimeters when the dawn returns. The breath continues its slow, rhythmic work, arriving like a cool mist through the wild bamboo and leaving like a soft shadow sliding across the limestone mortar. With each quiet cycle of air, the remaining knots of social tension in your jaw and behind your eyes are being gently rinsed away, falling down into the dark, wet soil where they can no longer bind your muscles or constrict the flow of your heart. Your shoulders have become entirely heavy. Your hands are lying loose and open on the sheets, their fingers completely untightened, like dormant hemp stalks waiting for the autumn rains. You have walked out of their court for the final time tonight, and the silence that meets you is not emptiness. It is the immense, comforting fullness of a home you never truly left. Sleep is not a privilege that you must earn by completing your personality perfectly or by resolving every social fracture before the lamps are extinguished. It is a natural right, a gentle returning of the seed to the deep underground channels from which all life first emerged. Let yourself roll back into that ancient, undisturbed earth, letting go of the need to be remembered, recognized, or understood by anyone on the other side of this night. You are allowed to be completely invisible for the next few hours. You are allowed to let your name and your social struggles fall away until they are nothing more than a faint murmur carried off by the mountain breeze. As the dark water closes over the image of the braided straw tray, the mind loses its desire to project itself into tomorrows, hallways, or to seek guarantees from the coming days. The future is just another unmapped terrace sitting out in the cold rain on a distant ridge, entirely beyond your reach until the light returns. For now, it is more than enough to simply be the weight that rests beneath the blankets, the quiet presence that requires no human validation to exist, and the silent heart that has finally stopped fighting its own natural gravity. Let yourself slide down into the deepest, heaviest pools of the evening, where the sediment is perfectly still, and the darkness is thick enough to hold you without a single word. And as the last trace of awareness dissolves into the soft shadow of the room, notice how the heavy armor of your social anxiety no longer feels like a structure to be maintained, but like a handful of dry dust that has finally found the dark, moist earth and vanished into the sweet quiet of the wild field. Down here, where the dust has lost its boundary and become one with the furrow, the very notion of a perimeter begins to dissolve into the dark. The mind has spent so many seasons believing that it is the box, that without that rigid, defensive shell of human approval, it would simply shatter into nothingness, leaving no trace of its existence behind. But the seed does not lose its identity when it falls from the wicker rim. It only reclaims its freedom to expand, to sink, and to find the lowest, most peaceful hollows in the wild earth. You have spent so much energy keeping your thoughts taut and vigilant to avoid the pain of being cast out. Yet, your true essence can never be truly exiled by a human vote, and your inner well can never be drained by a cold shoulder. The living universe simply parts around their small judgments, absorbs the friction of their whispers in its silent depths, and continues to carry your life toward its home. Let the lingering echoes of your contemporary struggles, the unanswered messages, the corporate rankings, and the constant, nagging whisper that you are falling behind the pace of your peers sink like heavy limestone pebbles into the deep mud of the ancient cistern. You do not have to dredge them up tonight, and you do not have to figure out how you will face the hallways of your workplace when the morning light touches the window. The world will continue its restless movement. The lowlands will continue to prize their superficial alliances, and the people who do not possess the capacity to see your true texture will continue to act from their own tight, fearful places. None of that requires your presence right now. Your only assignment for the remaining hours of this night is to allow the weight of your body to be completely taken by the mattress, letting go of the exhausting illusion that you must repair every broken relationship before you are allowed to rest. Think of how much vitality is restored to your spirit when you finally stop trying to fix your life through the lens of self-punishment. We carry our perceived social blunders around, like sacks of dry chaff, constantly weighing them against the accomplishments of others, wondering why our inner landscape feels so barren and exhausted. But the wisdom of the old gardener is not a demand for you to become an immaculate, flawless saint who never feels the sting of loneliness. It is simply an invitation to stop, clawing at the dirt to climb back into a container that was always too small for you. It is the realization that beneath the bitterest layer of your social anxiety, the sweet, unpolluted potential of your core humanity is already resting, perfectly intact, waiting only for you to stop treating their rejection as a permanent verdict on your worth. You do not need to manufacture a new persona. You only need to sit by the quiet basin of your own bare breathing and let the natural gravity of your being do the rest. The room around you has become a vast protective sanctuary, a dark granary vault that shields you from the biting winds of public opinion and the harsh glare of social comparison. The silence here is not an empty isolation. It is the thick, comforting density of a deep valley after the final harvest has been gathered, where every noise is muffled and every sharp memory is smoothed over by the soft, dark velvet of the night. You can feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of your abdomen, a slow tide that moves without any conscious effort on your part, proving that the earth is fully capable of sustaining you, even when you have completely abandoned the controls. With each breath that leaves your lips, imagine the remaining wicker borders of your anxiety dissolving into clear, weightless vapor, trickling down through the bedding and vanishing into the silent ground below. You are safe enough to let the sentry rest, the tired, shivering soldier who has spent years standing watch at the perimeter of your reputation can finally lay down his shield, step inside the earth hut, and close his eyes by the cooling embers of the willow fire. There are no wolves left to fight in this room, and there is no treasure left for anyone to steal, because the true gold of your nature is hidden so deeply within the non-judgmental fabric of the universe that no human hand can ever reach to diminish it. You can let the group think what it wants. You can let the pack whisper and the land barons claim their false victories, while you remain heavy, undisturbed, and sovereign within the dark majesty of your own internal space. As you drift closer to the absolute edge of sleep, let the image of the wild hemp seed settle into your chest like an old, familiar map. Its husk may be plain, its placement may be unmapped, and the soil around its shell may still carry the damp chill of the passing midsummer storm, but its center is wrapped securely within the hot, subterranean currents of the living earth, drawing up an invisible, inexhaustible nourishment that ensures its survival. You are that seed. Your belonging does not depend on the mildness of their glances or the approval of the kitchen ledger. It comes from your willingness to let your awareness drop beneath the frozen topsoil of your thoughts and rest in the hot, fluid core of your own breathing life. The last thoughts are beginning to lose their typography, blurring into soft, grey shapes that float like valley mist through the mountain passes. The words themselves are turning to simple, turning, comforting vibrations, a low lullaby of running water and shifting stone that gently nudges your spirit down into the deepest, darkest hollows of the night. There are no more insights to integrate, no more conversations to analyze, and no more self-protection to maintain. The tools have been dropped, the tray has been set down, and the water has found its way back to the silence of the underground channels. where it requires no human light to know its own way home. Let yourself go entirely into that nameless depth, sinking down past the memory of your name, past the history of your rejections, and past every definition the world has ever tried to carve onto your face. You are no longer the novice trying to please the kitchen. You are no longer the performer trying to buy a moment of safety with a false smile. And you are no longer the outsider peering through the window. You are simply the quiet, heavy presence that breathes in the dark, an uncarved piece of the mountain, resting in absolute peace while the wind covers the wild slopes far above. Sleep is yours tonight, unearned, unconditional, and as deep as the ancient reservoirs that run beneath the stone. And as the darkness becomes perfectly uniform, and the final ripple disappears from the surface of the pool, what if the peace you have been searching for across the exclusive landscapes was never a place you had to reach, but simply the softness that remains? When you finally let the tray tilt and allow yourself to land in the wild field,